ask you to post your questions in the Q&A throughout the talk, and then after the talk, we're going to be taking questions, and we like people to introduce themselves just by saying who they are and where they're from, and then their question. And if you could let me know if you prefer to read your question out yourself by turning on your camera, or if you prefer for me to read it out. And we have an example in the chat there. So I think we're all ready to go. So my name is Laura Mann, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of International Development at the LSE. And it's a big pleasure, and I'm very excited to introduce this panel this afternoon. I think, like everybody else, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with Twitter. I've definitely kind of learned a lot from people online and feel like my kind of network of people who I learn from and who hold me to account for my ideas has widened. I think that these platforms are very helpful for kind of capturing events and issues that the mainstream, quote unquote, mainstream media has sometimes neglected. I think these platforms are also really useful, particularly in development studies, in kind of countering and critiquing elite knowledge that can sometimes be quite insulated from realities on the ground, particularly if we're talking about the power asymmetry between researchers based in high-income countries studying peoples and societies in low and middle-income countries. So there's a kind of popular peer review potential there that could be very productive and get us at more nuanced and sort of more bottom-up understandings of the true nature of development. However, I also get very frustrated by social media, and particularly the kind of shiny hellscape of Twitter sometimes around misinformation, polarization, and manipulation, particularly around conflicts in Ethiopia, in Syria, and now in Ukraine. And there's also a difference between kind of popular peer review of bad helicopter researchers and the denialism of good research. We've seen this both in terms of public health, but also in human rights situations where governments can use popular rhetoric online to try and cast doubt and discredit good quality research. So there's a double-edged sword there to that kind of popular bottom-up peer review. I also worry that digital infrastructures are kind of seen as these neural networks that are reflecting the world as it is, but there's a real patchiness and unrepresentativeness both on social media, but also on digital platforms more broadly, and some of the economic platforms that I study. And so I wonder worry that patchiness is kind of skewing our understandings of the world and kind of affecting the way that policymakers and politicians try to gauge public opinion and build political platforms and policies. So, you know, one of the things I do in my course when I talk about digital development is start that discussion with a conversation around the material and physical infrastructure of the internet and the financial costs involved, and the sense that it is actually based within borders and it has a geography. And not everybody experiences the same internet. Where you are in the world shapes the degree to which you can access it and the degree to which it's regulated and what is being optimized. So while we think of these platforms as very horizontal, there's a geography and a politics to digital systems. And we have to kind of understand this geography and this hierarchies to understand how it's shaping our understandings of development. So I'm really excited that we have such a stellar lineup of experts to help us understand these issues, to kind of think about how we can salvage the promise of digital technologies for a more kind of deliberative and more nuanced understanding of development on the ground. So the first person I want to introduce is Nanjala Nyabola, who is a writer and researcher based in Nairobi, Kenya. Her work is at the intersection of technology, media, and society, and she's the author of a growing number of excellent books, including Digital Democracy, Analog Politics, How the Internet Era is Transforming Politics in Kenya. And she has a new book about to come out, Strange and Difficult Times, Notes on a Global Pandemic. We're also joined by Idris Ahmed, who is the Director of Journalism at the University of Essex. He's one of the founding editors of New Lines magazines and is a contributing editor of the LA Review of Books. I think he's currently writing a book on war narratives on Syria that kind of deals with some of these issues around Syria in particular. We also have Amir Khan, who is a former Reuters foreign correspondent and a BBC investigative journalist. He was working with human rights-based groups in the Middle East when the Arab Spring broke out. And in 2020, sensing the kind of critical threat of online manipulation and how it was shaping journalists, activists, and political movements, he founded Valiant Projects with the aim of leveling the playing field and kind of understanding this infrastructure for good, I guess, in the world. And he has been working, how I know him is through his work with the transitional government in Sudan. And finally, and by no means least, we have Kecheng Fang, who is an assistant professor of journalism at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And his research interests include digital media, journalism, and political communication. So I think we have a really wonderful lineup of experts to help us understand these issues. So the first question I want to ask the panelists is how they understand the kind of promise of these systems and these technologies for development and for making development sort of more deliberative and our understandings of development more tailored to what's happening on the ground. And I'm going to start with Manjala.
Thank you, Laura. I think that the best way to understand the impact that digital technologies are having on political life, and this is what I try to go into in digital democracy, is just go back to the basics. What do people use public spaces for? What is the public sphere for? How is it constituted? What kind of interactions does it make possible, and what does it constrain? I think what we've seen, or we saw before the rise of the digital age, is the rise of the ivory tower, if you will, or this sort of the concretization of the ivory tower, that you had all these practitioners kind of talking to each other and circulating within their own conferences, exchanging very sort of insider speak, you know, to describe specific context, to describe specific situations, sort of the powers being distributed in such a way that it was really tilted away from ordinary people and towards those who had it. And part of that is this aspect of the public sphere, which is constituted by the ability to deliberate, right? Whoever controls the agenda, whoever controls the story, whoever is able to order the story is the person who is able to order the action that happens within a society. I think the power of social networking sites is that it made it possible for ordinary people to have that agenda setting power. It made it possible for people to demand the attention of those who hold power and also of their peers sort of across the society, so vertically and horizontally. It made it possible for ordinary people to insert themselves into discourse that they were otherwise excluded from. And you find that in social networking sites, the people who have power in the analog world have to meet people where they are. They have to kind of immerse themselves. They have to, you know, follow the unspoken rules of social interactions. They have to learn how to use hashtags. They have to learn how to read trending topics. They have to bring themselves to the level of ordinary people. And I think there's a certain power to this. That's the disruptive power of social networking sites. It makes it possible for ordinary people at a critical mass to exercise agenda setting power in the public sphere, and to tell stories and to construct narratives that reflect their own interests and their own perspectives. It's not an infinite power. It's not a power that cannot be circumscribed. It's not a power that cannot be manipulated. It's not a power that cannot be, it's not completely insulated from broader consequences. It's a power that often runs up against, for example, what we're experiencing now with Twitter. What's the power of private capital in shaping access to those platforms? What's the power, you know, we're in a situation whereby an American founder has absolute power to switch off at the tap this platform that many ordinary people around the world are completely dependent on for their political, social objectives. What happens to women in Iran when Elon Musk switches off Twitter? What happens to, protesters who have become completely dependent on this as a place of getting their voices heard when the demands of the American legislative, economic, financial, fiscal, whatever context make it such a way that the platforms can't exist anymore? There are definitely many tensions embedded in there. But I think specifically in the context of development and development as practitioner domain or whatever, I think what we had seen for a long time was this growing gap between how the objectives of development are articulated, what is development for, and how ordinary people understand development. What does development mean? This sort of apolitical perspective of a development, which actually bleeds so many of the political demands that people have of their societies and of their political systems, was kind of ringing hollow, I think, for a lot of people. They were not asking for toothless, agendas. They were not asking for milquetoast sort of for example, if you think about what happens with the feminist agenda when it meets development discourse and it becomes this very sort of milky, I call it the warm milk version of the radical demands of feminism, that, let's just get, one more woman in the boardroom and then it'll all be well and done. Whereas a lot of the feminist action is actually demanding radical transformation of the societies that people live in. And people are not asking for governments to come and do small sort of mealy mouth sort of small projects, but they're actually asking for radical transformations of their social and economic political systems. And I think what this ability to set the agenda has done in a lot of countries, it's allowed people to push for more radical interpretations of what development is supposed to mean. We're no longer just merely accepting the World Bank, IMF interpretations of development, this sort of even the good governance agenda, I think, had kind of been pushed off the front page. Now it was just like, let's just build a couple of bridges and say that we've done something good. But I think we're seeing a lot more radical demands being articulated, that justice is back on the agenda and equality is back on the agenda, and addressing inequality as a root cause. You saw this in the COVID pandemic. This is the radical demand, was not that that rich countries, and I say rich countries are not Western countries, but rich countries would make vaccines available to poor countries when they were ready. The radical demand was for equality from the beginning. And that demand, being articulated to power in very clear terms in ways that is not couched in diplomatic speak, it's not couched in insider speak, it's not couched in technical speak, being able to build a critical mass of people online making that demand, having that knock-on impact on, power holders and forcing people to be transparent and to be accountable about how vaccines are being demanded. I think there is where you start to really see that it shapes the agenda. It makes it possible for ordinary people to insert themselves into the agenda setting in the development discourse. And I think we've seen a lot of significant transformations because of that. I would end by saying, once again, reinforcing, it's not a perfect system. It's not a system that is beyond influence, and it's not beyond manipulation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Nanjala. That was wonderful to start us off. I want to now bring in Idris, if that's okay, and sort of ask you to give your opinion about this. How do you see the potential of social media for nuancing our understandings of development? And you're on mute.
Yeah, so just to add to what Nanjala was saying, there's I think there has been shifts in the dynamic over the years. We started when social media came along with this sense of immense understanding of that emancipatory potential. There was this leveling of the power, and people had more of a capacity to articulate their demands and also to challenge these the prevailing idea of what development is supposed to be. And over time, that had an impact. Some of the way, kind of on a way grassroots level, there were all these initiatives about bringing more transparency to how funds were spent, development funds were spent, about monitoring corruption, monitoring activities of the police or any other element of society. And what happened over time is that some of those things are still very important. Like, I think that in many respects, many of these state bodies are far more accountable than they used to be. But what has happened is that on the political level, there has been this attempt to create synthetic activity, which kind of it tries to it simulates what public demand looks like, and it tries to neutralize what is the genuine or authentic public demand. And I think that that's where the darker side of technology comes in. So over the years, people in power, they learned that the way to neutralize demands which are inconvenient to them was to create these types of synthetic activity to challenge that. And in my case, because I monitor conflicts, that became quite clear that at the beginning, one of many of these revolutions that started at the beginning of the last decade came out of this ability to articulate your demands, to form communities around them, and to mobilize public opinion around them. But over time, again, the people in power, they started realizing that those same tools can be also used for surveillance, for monitoring the activities of and also neutralizing these activities. So I think in that respect, we have seen over time things change, and probably we are in the most dangerous phase right now, because one of the positive things that happened because of the experience of 2016 onwards and greater awareness of disinformation, misinformation, and how they were undercutting this emancipatory potential of these tools was that eventually, around 2018 onwards, many of these social media companies started taking action to curb these type of activities, started labeling disinformation, and started also taking actions against any synthetic accounts, bot networks and all. But right now, as we are seeing, that all of that is being eroded. So again, once we are in that place where it will become a field of struggle again, we don't know how this thing is going to turn out at the moment. Twitter, which I think was, because of its immediacy, was the most important tool in this respect, has been undermined by the developments of the past month. And so it remains to be seen, what we can extract out of it. I mean, one of the things that came out of our experience of the past decade was, I think Ukraine has fared so much better because there was a greater awareness of how these tools can be used, and information as the potential of information. And I think that Ukraine has been very successful in mobilizing public support and getting or even establishing the legitimacy of its fight. And I think that that's, it's not what applies in conflicts is very similar to what happens in society in general. So I think that, we are seeing, we had seen gains which are currently being eroded, and that's why we are back in the fight. So we will have to see over time that how we counter this new danger that is being posed.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to bring in Kacheng here now, because we've been talking a lot about kind of US platforms, and you are in a sort of enviable position to be looking at this both in terms of discussions of China on US platforms, but also looking at Chinese platforms. So could you sort of give us that perspective?
Sure. Yeah, as we all know, the Chinese context is very, very different. But I should emphasize that China is not totally isolated from the world. So both Nanjala and Idris mentioned Twitter, for example. We are also worried about Twitter because, for example, a recent example is last weekend, there was a wave of quite surprising protest against the COVID-0 policy in China. I guess many of you have seen the news. And actually, during the protest, Twitter served as a good tool for archival purposes, because all those photos, short videos, you could take that, you could try to post that on Weibo and WeChat Chinese platform, but they will soon be deleted. So many posted that on Twitter, and Twitter became a good archival tool. And people go to Twitter and then download again and post it again on Weibo and delete it, and people go to Twitter again, right? So Elon Musk is doing something with Twitter, and we fear that if Twitter is going to diminish, then we have to find another archival tool. So that's one thing I want to say. But of course, in China, most people daily engagement is with domestic platforms. So about the positive and negative consequences of those platforms, I want to use 3 examples. one good one, one bad one, and one mixed example. So good example is in terms of economic development. I think when we talk about development, it's not only political development, right? So a good example is, for example, we all know TikTok is popular all around the world, right? Its major competitor in China is called Kuaishou. And so one thing that Kuai and TikTok, the Chinese version, Douyin, were doing is to help farmers to do live streaming, live e-commerce streaming to sell the products, which are maybe unsellable agricultural products, apples, oranges, vegetables like that. So, I mean, during previous years, China has been more or less in the lockdown mode. So the market is not in full operation. So there's a lack of market information. It's very difficult for farmers to sell the products. Maybe low awareness of good products in distant rural areas, and there's insufficient promotion of those products. So the farmers are actually using these short video platforms to do live streaming, and people can just, when watching the live video, they can just purchase those agricultural products, which really helped a lot with farmers' lives. So I think this is a great example of how social media platform can do good for development. But of course, this happened in China and promoted by platforms and government because it is in line with government policy. It is definitely in line with one of the major policies of the current Chinese administration, which is poverty alleviation. So this contributes a lot to this major policy of Xi Jinping. So that has been promoted. So that's a good example. That's in line with government. The bad example, of course, is surveillance, right? As we know that in China, people have to scan their health code everywhere. So health code is not only for health. So people fear that, but it also actually happened. So in this June, in a city called Zhengzhou in China, one local bank in that city actually tried to turn many savers, the account holders' health code into red, so that those people cannot travel. They cannot travel because they want to travel because suddenly people found that they cannot withdraw money from their accounts. So the bank was in a problem. And so many people wanted to go to Zhengzhou and to protest, to get their money back. But the local government and local bank collaborated in turning the health code into red, so they cannot travel. So that's a bad example of how China is building this surveillance state, and the platform companies definitely helping the government to do that. And one mixed example is so-called public opinion monitoring. So collecting public opinion is good, right? The government has to listen to the people, right? Or even though China is an authoritarian government, people, political scientists theory Chinese government as responsive authoritarianism, meaning that Chinese government still has to listen to the citizens, to the people. And so they are spend a lot of money collecting what people have been saying online, right? So this is a good thing, but I say it's mixed because usually the result is that local governments spend a lot of money, collect information, collect social media posts, and they will ask the platform to delete those unfavorable posts, those posts that criticizing the government. So it's listening to people, but also trying to silence people, right? So I think in terms of public opinion monitoring, it's really a mixed result here. So I think from these three examples in China, we could really say that maybe in authoritarian regimes, especially in China, whether social media can do good or do bad, really to a large extent, it depends on what the government wants to do and also how the platforms are collaborating with the government.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is kind of where I wanted to take the conversation next, is this issue of kind of how these platforms, I think technology companies like us to think that any kind of change is inevitable, that it's driven by the technology, but it is often driven by the kind of curation and the rules that are kind of embedded into these systems and the way that these systems are companies often, or sometimes governments, with sort of certain interests, right? And they're sort of building incentive structures in order to optimize and maximize things. So I think this issue of optimization and thinking about what is being optimized and how we can kind of reshape optimization for more developmental ends is an interesting way of getting at this. And I wanted to bring in Amil here to talk a little bit about how he understands what is being optimized on these platforms, how he thinks it's changing what's being optimized, and whether he has any kind of hope of a better, more progressive kind of optimization being possible.
Thanks very much, Laura. That's a really interesting question, particularly the issue of, is there hope for an optimization that's more progressive or better? I think in short, the answer is that as private companies, the platforms are optimized to maximize profit for shareholders, without a doubt. And I remember around January 6th, where we saw the insurrection, to use the popularly used phrase, in the US after the last election. One of the founders on Reddit said, of course, the reason why, and he's no longer a Reddit, but he was talking about how the internal thinking works within the decision-making group in these platforms. He says, you have to remember that platform's number one priority is the continued survival of the platform. So that's the first thing they have to do. And the reason why at the time Twitter decided to remove Trump, despite all of the other violations that he'd done of their terms and conditions, and why they decided to remove him in January 6th, was because his actions made them think that he actually threatened the platform. He threatened the entire sort of setup of the economy. If the insurrection had happened, nobody knows what America would look like after that. In which case, the survival of the platform, the survival of the dynamics that allows it to exist legally, financially, would be threatened. So it was just a survival issue. They just got rid of him. Of course, the fact that these rules impact our very real world, these kind of sort of virtual rules almost in a virtual world, has been clear from the time of the Arab Spring, at least when I worked on it. The promise, to slightly reflect on the first question, was that the dynamics of power had changed. And Angela has spoken about that really succinctly there. And I think what the promise was beyond that was that we could change the decision makers' calculations. So if before, the decision makers were people who just sat at the top and talked to other decision makers in those ivory towers, and Angela mentioned that somehow popular dissatisfaction or popular demand would change all of that. And I think a lot of people have written about this and mentioned that that was only possible around the time of the Arab Spring because of the technical way in which the platforms worked at the time, which then changed after 2015. So one very obvious example, although there are others, was that at the time, both Facebook particularly and the others, they were much more chronological in the way that they worked, and the way the algorithm prioritized content was much more based on what came up and then what got attention. And then the algorithms became a lot more sort of they became harder to fathom the factors that they were prioritizing in order to push different types of content on your feed. But that's not to say that they were a completely closed box. So if you look online, you look on YouTube and you look up videos to maximize reach, there's an entire cottage industry of people all over the world who will tell you that you should put a sense of jeopardy in the first 3 seconds of your video, or that you should use yellow and not red. And this is based on people doing A/B testing, essentially. So they look at what works, what exactly works, how do we game the algorithm? Because if there is an algorithm, if there is a system, then we have ways of gaming it. And again, and this is the key thing that I want to refer to, the driving factor there is money. So the kind of people who are figuring out how to game algorithms is not the development sector or even really governments or the private sector, you know, on a sort of like huge corporates. It's young, mostly men, sometimes women, sitting all over the world, and a lot of the time in lower income countries, trying to figure out how they can make money by servicing people who do drop shipping, selling trainers, you know, all sorts of stuff, while bypassing the sort of often broken systems in their own country. Once they do, and once they figure it out, those learnings seep over into politics. And you mentioned that we'd been working in Sudan, that I worked in Sudan. We see maybe a group of 100, 200 people in Khartoum who are able to do this, who learn about this, who go online, find the forums, experiment on it, use it to make themselves, you know, a modest income often. And then somebody will turn up and say, hey, would you mind doing this do you want to do, we can employ you, we can pay you $300 or $400 a month. And then suddenly there's a new industry there servicing political actors. So what can platforms do about this? I would say first and foremost, let's start with the legislators. The legislators have to understand that this is a financial issue, and often the driving factor here is finance, whether it's on the, you know, micro level of an individual trying to earn money, or the platforms themselves, or all the middlemen in between. So there's no point asking platforms to come up with terms and conditions around hate speech, etc., if we don't also then look at the incentivization around it. And there's some very good work done by quite a few writers on this issue, and the even specific demands are there. Like, we know what kind of things that these guys should do. The question is whether or not the political will is there, because there are also a lot of other dynamics in play around, you know, the sort of traditional interplay between power, money, and politics. So I think what we have to do there is look where the money is. And the key example I'd end with is to think about the Alex Jones trial, which I'm sure a lot of people looked at, where people that he had defamed were awarded, I think there are multiple hundreds of millions of dollars. The coverage talked about, it drew attention to the idea of the lucrative lying. And when we talk about the manipulation of social media, which Nanjao touched on just towards the end of the point where she was making, we have to look at how bad information or just straight out lies and manipulation can earn people money, and attack it at that point.
Thank you very much, Hamid. I don't know, I just want to throw this open to the other panelists if they want to respond to that.
Just to add a dimension to what Emil was talking about, the other piece, there's a really fantastic essay that went around a couple of months ago, and the title has kind of stayed with me, and it was called Lies, the Truth is Expensive and the Lies Are Free. Because obviously the other part of this dimension is the impact that it has on the misinformation economy, and how a lot of this stuff is, the initial interest is not in spreading COVID misinformation, it's not in influencing political behavior, it's not in anything that grandiose. These people are just literally trying to make ends meet. And I think part of it is this failure to understand that all of this stuff is operating within an ecosystem. We tend to look at we have historically looked at social networking sites. It's kind of like a niche thing that all of these young people are doing, and it doesn't have any connection. And by the time sort of mainstream political systems kind of woke up to what was happening with social networking sites, many of these underlying structures were already in place. When we talk about narratives, how narratives get shaped and transmitted across social media, people learning how to game algorithms in very simple, very banal ways, and then sort of turning that, the people who turn that into sort of political action, it's often very interesting, surprising characters that people haven't really been paying attention to in other contexts. I think about, for example, the examples that I have in the book where I talk about many of the patterns that we see between young men, disgruntled young men, going from being angry at women, then going into becoming low-level political operatives and building these massive digital systems where they are able to influence discourse online actually replicates across so many geographies. It's actually fascinating because we saw it in Kenya as well. We've seen it in the United States. We're seeing it in many countries in Europe. We're seeing it in many countries in Asia. And that pattern is really, to go to Emil's point about how the initial impetus probably has nothing to do with politics, but what the politicians have that these networks want is money. And what the politicians have is this desire to influence that discourse and being able to put money towards it. And the last piece of that then becomes, well, we talk about what do we do about it? There has to be a political interest in doing something about it. And I think in many countries, this is the piece that's missing, because many of the people who should be creating the legislation, should be creating the policy context that speaks to these issues are benefiting from these issues. You know, the biggest users, there was before these changes that happened in 2020, 2019, I think, pandemic timelines are a mess, but I think it was 2019. Some of the biggest users of these astroturfing, these sort of mass tweeting of activists, of, you know, on Instagram, whatever, it was governments, right? If they wanted to silence you on the Ethiopian war, you know, all you had to do was say something about Ethiopia and you would get 200 of the same comments, you know, to make Twitter unusable for journalists, to make it unusable for activists. There are several African governments that have used this tactic repeatedly with activists. There's several Western governments, not Western governments, but there's several governments in Europe, for example, that have used this, you know, Hungary used this tactic against activists and journalists and critics of the state. And so I think part of it is, in the absence, there's contexts in which there is legislative will and there is legislative policy will to create a sort of, to address this issue. But for many parts of the world, there isn't a legislative will because the people who run the legislatures are the people who are benefiting from this issue. And I think this is a regulatory knot that also needs to be entangled. And for the moment, it seems that people will increasingly be dependent on the American legislature and the American policymaking space, or the Chinese policymaking space, if we're talking about TikTok, if we're talking about Weibo and all of these other platforms, and lately the European policymaking space, because it looks like, for example, if there's going to be any action on what's happening on Twitter, it's going to come from Brussels. It's not going to come from DC. And I think, as a law nerd, I find it very fascinating because it's a new frontier of international rulemaking. I think in practical terms, there's a power shift that's happened specifically, that has specifically left activists, journalists, opposition candidates in the global South and in poor countries, particularly vulnerable and dependent on policy actions being taken in contexts where they have no power and where they have no voice to impact how they're going to be able to do their activism, to do their protesting, to do their organizing.
Thank you very much, Nanjala. That was very useful. And I want to bring in Kacheng here because when we kind of, particularly if we're thinking about African countries, you know, there's US platforms, but there's also increasingly Chinese platforms who are kind of investing also in infrastructure in terms of the internet and mobile phones. So I wanted to ask if you think the same things are being optimized on these Chinese platforms as being optimized on US-based platforms, and whether you think that the same dynamics that Nanjala was talking about citizens in low and middle income countries kind of being dependent on US and European legislators also exist in terms of the kind of dynamics with Chinese platforms.
Mm-hmm. Of course, there are similarities and differences. I think the underlying logic, Emil just mentioned, money is actually the same thing, important for Chinese platforms. So, for example, there are a lot of nationalistic content on Chinese social media platforms, but actually they're not produced by the Chinese government's propaganda machine. They're produced by private companies who really want to gain traffic, gain advertising revenue because they know that on social media platforms, those nationalistic content, because they are more emotional, because they're about identity, so they're more easily go viral. So they can gain a lot. So it's not necessarily those private companies, the bosses are really that patriotic or nationalistic. It's simply because they want to make money. And this all even have an international, transnational dimension. So a few years ago, I published an article about how the kind of alt-right disinformation and conspiracy theories were actually imported by some opinion leaders on Weibo to the Chinese context. So there's a lot of disinformation circulating on Chinese platforms about, for example, how immigrants, refugees in European countries are kind of basically rapists. Those kind of disinformation are rampant on Chinese social media. There are a lot of those disinformation just because those social media accounts are driven by the same economic incentive to publish those kind of information. So I guess the one Laura asked, what has been optimized on social media platforms? So I think we can go back to, for example, Mark Zuckerberg. What he mentioned, he argued when he firstly founded Facebook, he was saying he really wanted to connect the whole world. So I think what has been optimized is this kind of connection, especially two kinds of connection, human to human connection and human to information connection, right? Human to human, this kind of connection can do good, just like the live streaming e-commerce example, like I just mentioned. You can connect customers and sellers who were not connected before, but you can also connect, for example, trolls, right? Trolls with journalists, right? Then that could pose a lot of threats to journalistic safety, right? So there's good things and bad things in this kind of connection, and also human to information connection. Of course, you can connect high quality educational content with people in rural areas like that. But of course, more often we see is misinformation, sensationalism, this kind of emotional information, just like Najala mentioned, the angry people, right? Why everyone is so angry online? Because it really facilitates this kind of emotional information to circulate among people. So a lot of so politicians and private companies, they really have a lot to gain if they take advantage of this optimized connection. So so I think for us, if we want to really to improve the situation, one thing that we should think of is that we want another kind of optimized social media, which emphasizes on inclusion, but also emphasizes on safety, right? So maybe we want some controlled connection between humans and between human and information. But the problem is, usually this kind of model is not the best for business. So I think the ultimate thing is that, like, how to make a good business model, which is inclusive, safe, and can make profit. So I think that's one thing that's really about the future of how and whether a social media platform can evolve into a direction that is more optimized for social good.
So I'm glad that you left it on kind of thinking about the potential for other kinds of optimization. I don't know if this is too hard a question to ask EJS, but whether, what would he like to see optimized, for example, on Twitter? And does he have any sense of how we can get to a kind of better kind of optimization? And you're on mute, I'm afraid.
We're seeing a kind of optimization on Twitter happen right now, which has actually obviously worsened things because the curation that is happening right now is very ideological. So because Elon Musk's claim is that he's going to rectify this, what he says is this kind of an overly woke version of Twitter by giving more voice to right-wing voices. So now at the top, you have got this star kind of a thing, which you can click to make it either chronological or something that is more according to his political wishes. I think we have to, go to when we look at the fundamentals of what is being sold on these platforms. It's basically, the competition is for attention, that all these platforms are competing for attention. That is what they're monetizing. And the thing is, until, which doesn't seem likely, that we come up with our own networks, which have a different model. So we will have to, in a sense, either adopt our messaging to that. Probably a good example of that was what John Fetterman did during the last election, that he was really successful in grabbing attention, because what the social media companies, their optimization has been all about finding out what retains attention. And obviously emotive messages and conflict retains attention. That is one of the reasons why we have had, these platforms have become such a place for polarization. And so in a sense, what happened is that the messaging mostly was dominated by these angry voices. And what somebody like John Fetterman did was something very creative, that he created messaging which resonated, but it also cut through this this general inability. Sometimes we think that because somebody has got a good argument or a worthy cause, that will in itself be sufficient for gaining an audience, and it doesn't happen. But most of the time, it just doesn't happen. So that's why we will also, understanding the optimization becomes a necessity for anybody who wants to play the political game, and whether that's in the case of wanting a bridge across the river that has been just flooded, or whether it's kind of asking for, in Pakistan, for example, one of the things which has been quite successful is in Pakistan, deforestation was a major issue. That at its birth, Pakistan had over 33% forest cover, and now it's reduced to nearly 1%. So that only became an issue because people started posting videos and all of this type of activity, the deforestation, which in the past was just happening in the quiet. So, and that became an issue. So right now, environment, because in the past, as Nanjala was mentioning, that these used to be ivory tower issues. In Pakistan, many people used to feel that this is not something that impacts them on a daily basis. But now everybody has that sense, and everybody's making those connections. And a lot of the spread of these videos and all through social media has been, and anger sometimes has been an important resource, that people are getting angry about these things, and because of that, people are able to act. So that is something that we obviously have, because one of the things advantage that people had was that even like take the Arab Spring and other examples, or in China, the people had numbers, but it was just a matter how to turn it into a politically potent force. And that's why the synthetic activities started, the bot networks and everything started, that people were trying to neutralize that. And it will just be that if we are able to improve messaging, or generally civil society, when they're acting on any kind of a worthy cause, if the messaging is conscious of how these things are optimized and how attention is being sort of robbed, so then it will be possible to turn any kind of these political energies into something positive.
So what I'm getting from that is that you can't really take for granted the kind of transformative potential of these things. People have to be very proactive, very savvy, and very canny about using these. Before we open up to questions, I just want to ask all of the panelists, thinking about that, the kind of canniness, I want to ask them, what is it, we in the audience, we have lots of students and researchers who are interested in these issues, but also maybe activists. And, what do you think are the sort of ways forward, either in terms of researching the kind of mechanisms of these platforms and how to use them in progressive, strategic ways, or from an activist point of view, like what can people do to try to better understand these dynamics and be proactive about pushing them for more developmental purposes? I don't know if anybody wants to take that. Amir does. Okay.
So I think there's a lot of things that people can look at, but the issue is sometimes that they don't actually fit together in a traditional sense. So two things come to mind. If you want to research how this stuff works and how you can use it better, and to pick up on Idris's point of how do we make better content, One sort of underlying issue to look at, and which you can research in a traditional format, is the gray economy of social media. So micro trends. I've just got this report up here because I was looking at it. Did a report recently that said if you want, you can spend $2,600 and buy a social media account full of that has 300,000 followers. So somebody's curated that. This is a gray economy. It's really difficult. There's no real research out there on how this works, but I know that if you were an actor with nefarious intentions, you could go to pretty much any country in the world and find people who will sell you these accounts, rent you these accounts. You can definitely do it in Syria. If there's no ads in the country you're in, such as Sudan and Syria, where there's sanctions, there will be people who've spent months, years building accounts that have hundreds of thousands of followers and will come to you and say, yeah, if you give me, 100,000 whatever dollars a year for 3 hours a day, I will promote your political party. The rest of the time, I'll probably spend it promoting dodgy Bitcoin, or airdrops on dodgy cryptocurrencies. But there's an economy there, and we don't really know how that economy works. The second thing is social media strategy, which doesn't actually fit in a traditional sort of academic context right now. If you want to learn about that stuff, you're probably going to delve deep into YouTube videos to find out exactly how you edit a video. Exactly. There's some good work by people like Thomas Coombs, for example, who used to be at Amnesty, who looks at narratives, who looks at things like whether or not to pick up on Idris's point, in social media, yes, anger, shock, all these things drive attention, but there are more powerful human emotions as well out there, harder to hit, but more powerful if you get them to work, such as striving for a greater cause, achievement against the odds, the kind of things that turn up in John Lewis ads, that actually the world of advertising can be very good at once it puts its mind to it. So how do we make content that works, and how do development agencies? So development agencies, in my experience, normally are the biggest believers in the idea that you put content out there, as you mentioned, and it automatically is good content. It's true, not necessarily good, it's just true. And therefore it's just, you put it on a website and it goes viral. It must do, because it's true. And that's just not, as we know, as you said, that's not the case. How do you take that content further? How do you translate that content? And I think that links back into the first question of what is the transformative promise of social media. It is that, and we haven't really explored it. We haven't really used it. I was on a podcast a couple of years ago where somebody said, I'm fascinated and actually obsessed with the idea that if bad information can be presented in particular ways that it goes viral on social media, what does it look like when we do good information? And no one's answered that. We sort of have a go at that here, but it's not something that we get asked by clients about a lot either. So the demand is not there at the moment.
Thank you. Nanjala, did you want to add something there?
I mean, there are groups that have figured out that model. Upworthy is an example of this. Upworthy, Maria Popova, she's figured out that quite well. Letters of Note, the Dodo, which only does animal content. There are definitely groups that have figured out how to get positive information out there. I think the big puzzle is that what development organizations do badly, is they're not authentic. There's the lack of authenticity. And the thing that makes social networking so vital for many people is that they're having what they've experienced as authentic connections with strangers, with people who are similarly aligned in their worldview, with people who are similarly aligned in their interests, and they're not, the content that goes viral, positive content that goes viral is the one that feels least like you're being marketed to. There's been a lot of critique lately, for example, of UNHCR. UNHCR has invested a great deal of money into their social networking, into their messaging, and people just feel that it's inauthentic. Why are you trying to package other people's lives, misery, for my consumption? There's a hollowness there that I think people don't respond to. So I think that the real challenge for development organizations is to find a way of being authentic in an inauthentic, because social media is ultimately an inauthentic space. So how do you maintain authenticity in an inauthentic space? I think is a puzzle that needs to be resolved. It's not just for development organizations, I think for all organizations. There are diplomats, for example, who are fantastic at social media because they know when to tweet about geopolitics and when to tweet about football, when to be, here's what I had for lunch, and when to be, if we don't get XYZ concession, we're going to renegotiate our trade agreements. And I think there are others who their feeds are just haranguing, just shrill, and people will switch off because there's a certain inauthenticity to that. And I think it's finding that authentic voice, regardless of what that voice is, that I think is a big puzzle. But I would take a step back, and this is a bigger question that I think we're going to have to answer in the next couple of months, maybe even. Ultimately, social networking platforms are private spaces. They are owned by someone. Users are not the customers for social networking sites. Advertisers are the customers for social networking sites. One of the challenges that Facebook has, for example, I think at the last survey, is that Facebook has 3.2 billion accounts all over the world. Many of us have curated, because of the way the algorithms are set up, because the algorithms train us and we train ourselves to operate within the worlds that the algorithms make possible. And one of the things that's come with very intense curation is that many of us are only experiencing a small part of what is ultimately a very large network of people. A big number of the accounts that exists on these platforms are people who are doing terrible things. A big number of the traffic and a lot of the sites, YouTube is very good at looking the other way and giving the appearance of ineffectivity in the face of the way in which the algorithm has been repeatedly optimized for pornography, for violence against children, for all kinds of gore, for all kinds of things that would not pass muster. And unfortunately, as we've heard, the people who are really good at monetizing these social networking sites are the people who operate on this sort of dark web, on this darker side of all of these platforms. And I think one of the things that we're going to have to reconcile is that the private capital that makes social networking possible cannot indefinitely coexist with the dark matter, if you will, that constitutes a huge part of what drives traffic on these platforms. And I think as the guardrails start to fall off, because one of the major investments that, for example, Twitter had made in having a public policy team and having a human rights team and all of this was to try and to start to address these things, to incubate this public policy sort of, we are actually going to rise to the occasion that our users are demanding, that our users are inviting us to. And when those guardrails fall off, it creates opportunity for all of these people who are operating on the darker side of the web. It's 4chan, it's 8chan, it's even many, many parts of Reddit until Reddit had like that internal cleanup. So I think what we're entering into a space, and this is a question that has been on the minds of anybody who's been looking at the regulatory side of social networking. One, is a public interest first version of social networking possible? Is it possible for there to be a version of social networking that is publicly funded, that is owned by the users? Maybe it's a co-op model that's owned by the users, not subscribers, but users, where the profits and the risks are distributed. We've had listservs for many years and they worked really well. We had all other kinds of, this wave of privatization is a process that happened in the late 1990s, early 2000s, with the MySpace acquisition kind of shifting us away from the MySpace kind of, everybody's kind of building their own little version, to centralized authority, centralized profit-making, centralized extraction. So in thinking about alternatives and in thinking about positive ways of using social network, I think a more fundamental question is the question of ownership. Is a public interest, public owned version of social networking possible? And if so, what do we learn from the experiences of this hyper privatized, this hyper profiteering model that we can then graft into that space so that we're incubating the good and we're addressing this very huge chunk of these platforms that isn't about positive stories, that isn't about, there's accounts, sorry, but there's accounts in Mexican Facebook, I think, where there are 50,000, 100,000 people who are in these groups just to watch people post videos of men putting cameras under women's skirts. Like, that's also social networking that needs to be addressed in a way that, protects people and keeps people safe and keeps women safe and doesn't drive that traffic. So these are more, I think, fundamental questions that we those of us who are in the positive policy space, we often tiptoe around. But I think we have to sit with that. How do we incubate the good while addressing the bad?
Yeah, I think there's always this problem of scaling up things, right? That all of my research with digital tech people, at the beginning, people kind of thought things just went viral. But often you have these companies that actually invest and roll things out and build these physical networks, and they have the money to do that. And so I worry that a public interest kind of platform doesn't have that capital to do that kind of outreach.
Absolutely.
Building.
Absolutely.
The financial side of these things is really important. Okay, I definitely want to open up to questions from the audience. So you can either put up your hand or you can post your question in the chat. And again, if you could sort of give an introduction to yourself. While I'm waiting for questions, and please don't be shy or don't be intimidated by our speakers. They're very knowledgeable, but they're also very nice people. So please do ask them questions. But as we're waiting for questions, I might ask Cheng and Idris if they could talk about sort of areas of uncertainty or areas where we need research and we need people to kind of think about these things in a proactive, strategic way, or just curiosity based. What do we not understand about these systems?
Probably one of the things will be the old debate about should states be in a position to regulate all of this, because then obviously every state has very different motivation in regulating, and some are more democratic than others. So the idea of a public interest social network, if that can materialize sometime in the future, obviously that is a real benefit. But I think there's also one danger of because sometimes what we do is that we see, I saw one of the questions in the by Sheldon, I think had posted, was about that sometimes we also have to be mindful of the continuities, because many of the debates that social media has kind of highlighted were also issues back then. I mean, just to take Nanjala's last example about these websites about people pointing cameras up women's skirts. So that used to be very much like Daily Mail sidebar. Doesn't look much of an improvement on that. They call it the sidebar of shame. I mean, it's pretty much kind of the same activity, except it's on a legitimate newspaper. So some of these things are just, social media has kind of what it has done is just the fetters have been removed, but they were tendencies which existed. And same thing with the messaging. I mean, I agree with Sheldon's point there that messaging used to be an issue even in the past with the mainstream media. In fact, it used to be a bigger challenge because media was the ivory tower. So it used to regulate. In fact, your only option if the media somehow bungled some story would be that you could write a letter to the editor, and which never had the same impact as what we are able to do now, which is to challenge big publications right away if they misreport some story. So we have obviously gained a lot in that respect. It is just the fact that we understand that because of the way it's structured, these current social media, because of its profit motive, that it is never going to have the public interest as its priority. It is just a question that if we can somehow make it so. And again, Nanjala made a very important point about that inauthenticity of these big kind of sometimes humanitarian, sometimes development organization, that when they put out their messaging, I think what probably their logic is that if a lot of them are celebrity based, that if they can get somebody who already has a huge audience, that if they can get them to speak your message. But the thing is that that in itself, if it's a famous actor, maybe I like their films, but I'm not there kind of, I don't want to learn about, what's happening in Yemen or what's happening in some other part from this person. I would rather learn from somebody who can actually give me something that is, whose expertise gives them some authority to speak on a subject. Or sometimes if it's a good message, like Save the Children has done some really outstanding ads, and that's just because they were able to put across the message in a way that resonated. And in a sense, it did do the same thing, that it played with people's emotions. But the thing was, it was a way of bypassing that layer of apathy. So it's just, I think, a question of over time, the public interest is something that we will need to insert into it, as it was on many occasions. That, in a sense, like the universe, social media is kind of indifferent to our good and bad. That it'll be a question of, it'll be a fight for us, that how much good we can insert into it. And so just to finish off, a lot of people are abandoning Twitter at this moment because of the new ownership and all. I think that's a very bad idea. I feel like it's something worth fighting for, and again, for the same reason, that we cannot cede these grounds to people who are who are only going to use it for the worst possible motivations.
I'll be very brief since we have questions coming in. So I would just want to emphasize that we need more cross-disciplinary collaboration. We definitely need more computer scientists who know how to analyze the situation from a technological perspective. For example, we may know a little bit about text, images now, but for video, we know much less, right? And analyzing huge amount of video is much more difficult. And now we have AI generated text, image, and videos. So that's a whole new level. So I think we do need people from computer science background, from business, from development background, from media studies, from all these backgrounds to better collaborate.
Okay, I have 3 questions, and all of the people have told me they prefer for me to read it out. So we have shy questioners today. The question from Sheldon Rampton, who is a software engineer and a recovering journalist from the US. He says, a variety of social media have risen and fallen, each with different rules of engagement: Twitter, Facebook, Wikipedia, Silk Road, MySpace. I think the rules of each platform influence the type of behavior that happens there. Twitter, for example, is privately owned, easily facilitates anonymity, and enforces extreme concision in the conciseness in the length of messages that people are allowed to post. And the question at the end of this is, has anyone given thought about how we might classify and categorize social media so that we can decide what we want to promote and what we want to discourage? So that's a question about can we classify different platforms as having different kinds of rules and different kinds of effects? We also have a question from Avina, who is an LSE MSc behavioral science student from Greece. She had a question from Kaching. For Kaching, which is, you spoke about the possibility of controlled connections on social media. Who do you think should be responsible for deciding on how we control these connections? That might be a question other people also want to answer. And finally, we have a question from Aloma, who is also an LSE student from Barcelona. And she said, a topic we've not discussed is concerning those deciding what will go live and what will be censored, namely content moderators working for social media company in developing countries such as the Philippines. So would it be possible to discuss the negative externalities of this new type of work, and what is the role of legislatures regulating it? So I don't know if anybody wants to answer those 3 questions. Nanjale and Amir. Let's go for Amir first and then Nanjale.
So maybe I could draw together, I think there's a thread in all of those, which is about regulation and regulation of content, and who does the regulating. On Sheldon's question, actually, I think the question of who's the we is up for grabs. So can I maybe take a stab at that and say if the we in that sense in Sheldon's question is regulators possibly, or the public at large through public opinion, I would say that perhaps a slightly unpopular view is that having looked at the rules and regulations of social media platforms at length, the policies that they have, I've generally found them to be pretty extensive. The problem is in their enforcement very often. Like for sure they're not ideal, but if they were enforced to 100% of what they say, we wouldn't have a problem quite as bad as it is now. That would be a very good start. So I would say that their pushback, when they get called in front of Parliament and Congress, is that they just don't have enough resources, whereas whistleblowers would say, well, they're not really that interested, and of course they're private organizations, so it's kind of, we don't really know what's happening in the background. Maybe there's some political links, etc. Some things get closed down, some things don't. Some people are left alone and others are not, and it's not always clear what happens. So I think more focus on the application of those rules would be really useful. Some transparency. Self-regulation is not working that well. I think pretty much that's a consensus around that. But I think that what we need to ask then is the sort of smokescreen often put up by the platforms or people working for the platforms, is that we don't want to get stuck into this question of what is right and what is wrong, whose truth. And I think that some of that is common in these questions. Like, it comes down to that knotty issue of what is right and what is wrong. A lot of the most egregious examples of violations they do tackle in their policies around hateful content, around incitement to violence, etc. So we don't have to constantly have that argument, until it would be better to, I would say, to deal with the issues that are already outlined. So that would be where I would say that we really need to focus on to begin with. And the other is, the second point would be manipulation, online manipulation. The most direct, decisive language around what is allowed and what is not allowed is technical manipulation online. And just to end with an example, I remember Katie Hopkins, before she was thrown off Twitter, at one point she had a whole bunch of the bots removed that promote her content. And if you saw her rankings as in UK popular personalities on Twitter, she fell like 50 places or something, literally overnight. And she turned around and said, "Oh, I'm being censored." And there was no censoring. It wasn't a content moderation issue at all. It was a manipulation issue.
Thank you very much, Amir. Nanjala.
I want to take two questions. One is on the content moderation question. And I think there's two levels to this. In fact, there's two levels to both the questions that I'm going to answer. There's two levels to this question about content moderation. One is, and I make this point really in all of the analysis that I've been doing about this Twitter acquisition, there is a distinction between the social networking sites as private capital, as businesses, and how they behave as platforms. Mm-hmm. As platforms, content moderation is crucial to keeping people safe. There has to be, in my previous answer, I talked a lot about how there's huge swaths of these networking sites that are dedicated to really terrible criminal activity that causes harm and can inadvertently cause harm, but also directly causes harm to young people, to all kinds of people. And content moderation is crucial to being a buffer between that negative content and ordinary users. It's the very, very, very least baseline responsibilities of the people who are making money off of these platforms owe to their users. But the second level of it is the broader social human implication. I think this is what the question is getting at. And I think for me, what I connected to is that this is just mercantile accumulation, and in the worst way possible, because it requires an exploited underclass in order to make the social experience of the rest of us possible. Content moderators experience tremendous harm. They are exposed to the worst of human behavior for 12, 14 hours a day for $2 a day. They experience severe mental health ramifications for the work that they do. And yet, as I said in the previous part, their work is necessary to keeping us safe online. And I think from a philosophical perspective, where I always come back to is what ties into the next question: is any of this necessary? Like, are we supposed to be speaking to each other on these. I use social networking sites. I enjoy using social networking sites. They've been very good for me professionally and personally. Is it good for the human species for us to be this hyper connected all the time? I think that's an important question. I think when you especially you look at the experience of content moderators, I think it's an urgent philosophical question that, we talked about, we need to work with computer scientists. I think we also need to work with ethicists and moral philosophers and humanists and people to really think deeply about what are the human ramifications of the system that we're building, because there's people are paying, there's externalities. Economists talk about externalities. There's externalities to this level of connection, and we haven't, just because we can't attach a monetary price to it, doesn't mean that they're not there. Just because the social networking sites have figured out a way of doing it cheap doesn't mean that there isn't a cost to it. It just means that they're only paying part of the cost. And the second question is the one about Brave New World and should we not be connected, etc. Look, I think, again, there's two levels to this. The first level is we are discussing this as researchers, as practitioners, because it is part of the contemporary human experience, and we have to understand the contemporary human experience in order to respond to it. And the reality is that for many people around the world, social networking sites have made social, economic, and political transformations possible that would not have otherwise been possible. When we talk about protest movements, we talk about the Arab Spring, we talk about My Dress, My Choice, we talk about what's happening in Iran and all of these things. When you are in an authoritarian system where there is state capture of press, there is state capture of the public sphere, what social networking sites have done is that they've allowed people to circumvent power. And as I said at the beginning, to set the agenda for political discourse, to demand accountability and to claim that space. That cannot be negated just because on the other side of the world, there is this escapism and there is this, dependency, social dependency that the social networking sites have created. Just because it's digital doesn't mean that it's not real. It's real. It's part of how we live. The other side of it, though, is that, again, there are externalities to this, and we are only now starting to grapple with these. I think one of the things that came out of the Hagen testimony at Brussels and has been, I think, a big part of the UK's regulatory push in the last couple of months is the impact, for example, that Instagram is having on young women's perception of self. That, 14-year-old girl committing suicide because of the bullying that she experiences online. That they are things that are nudges that are happening to our perceptions of self that hyperconnectivity is making possible, that we do actually have to sit with. And these are not just things that are happening in rich countries, these are things that are happening all over the world. So I think recognizing that complexity, we recognize it and we sit in it as researchers, and we sit in it as people who are immersed in these spaces, and we try and find ways of making sense of it. But we cannot say, it's not real because it's only happening on your computer, it's only happening on your phone. There are knock-on effects. And what we're trying to do is to create a research environment and a policy environment in which we are cognizant of these knock-on effects. And we are trying to push people towards being more accountable for them and towards being more responsive to them.
Thank you, Nanjal. You also contained a lot of things there for researchers and students who want to look at the kind of the on-stage and the off-stage effects of these things, and the way that it's like the oil economy, right? That the carbon-based democracies in high-income countries have this whole political economy that sustains them in other parts of the world, and sort of thinking about these connections globally is really important. We only have 10 more minutes and other questions have come in. So I want to quickly go to Kacheng because one of the questions was specifically for him. But then Idris, if you could look at the other questions in the chat.
Actually, I have been looking at the other questions. So actually, my answer to the question about like how we really control these connections is actually related to the latest question by Drew, because I do think that the starting point is users ourselves. It's the user agency that you mentioned in your question. So that's also from my personal experience. So I was once subject to a huge wave of pro-government trolls attack and harassment on a Chinese social media platform. And during that time, I asked for help from the platform company I asked them to shut down the comment section of my posts, and they refused to do so. They simply say that they don't have this function for me to shut down all the comments, so that the only option for me is to delete all my posts, so the comments will disappear. I think this is crazy, right? It's ridiculous. So I think the starting point is users ourselves. We should give more control, more power to users in terms of privacy settings, message settings, blocking unwanted messages like that. But I understand why platforms are not willing to do so, or they are not incentivized to do that, because like the oil economy you just mentioned, so platforms data is the new oil, right? So they are incentivized to collect as many data as possible. So they will not lose any opportunity to collect more data. So so it's bad for the business. So I do think that then we cannot really rely on the so-called self-regulation of the platforms. We have to bring in regulation. Usually, business models which are bad for the society, unfortunately, they will be good for scaling up, for making a lot of profit. So that's when regulation should come in. But regulation is not only a top-down thing, because I do think that, for example, when we talk about user agency, user awareness, we do need a kind of campaign for public awareness of these issues, right? Without that, even if the platforms are providing these functions, the users do not have enough awareness or literacy to use that functions to protect themselves, right? So we do in this turn, we do need NGOs, we do need educators, we do need civil society to have these campaigns, not only to raise awareness, but also to put more pressure on the platform companies. So that's how I combine these two questions and give my opinion on that.
Okay, I just want to give an opportunity to Idris and also to Emil to sort of reflect on the questions and also some of the other answers to the questions. At this point, I've lost kind of specific questions because there had been such good discussions.
I can quickly respond to some of these last questions. Julia Tokarczyk and Afifa Sultan asked a question which are kind of related, which is about how news spreads over social media and whether there's a personal responsibility as well in what we consume. I think we certainly have for the future a social responsibility in preparing people for that. This is life now, that these things are going to be part of how we exist. So the question is that how we adopt to them. And one of the things will be that how we consume media, how we process information. And once we know, if everybody has that understanding that we are manipulated through our reflexive responses, so a way of approaching social media in a bit more deliberative way, that when we get something, see something which may accord with our prejudices, that we may be inclined to share it immediately, but that if we make it a kind of a we encourage people from a young age that whenever they see something that seems to be something that readily agrees with their prejudices, that just to take the time, that here are a few steps that you can, just to ensure for your own protection, for just to prevent yourself from being manipulated, that there are a few things you can do. So yes, there should be in the future that personal and social responsibility should be something that we have to pick up on a larger level. And as for what kind of news spreads on social media, once again, we can always check the credibility of the sources, and we can again do the test in terms of if it's just some random blog with nobody's name attached to it. So there's no reason to believe that people maybe, there are circumstances in which random blogs with anonymous people have been telling the truth, so we shouldn't exclude that. But the thing is that there should be a few, everybody should have that, some few tests built into that, like how to verify the credibility of sources and how to ensure that that is truth by checking multiple sources. If we can build that into again our literacy programs, that is going to be really useful. But the last thing about the Brave New World, I think that is not a new problem. Going back to Neil Postman, that we have been dealing with that thing, that we are flooded with entertainment. And same thing even now, more so. There was a very interesting story which I would encourage everybody to follow recently on 60 Minutes, which was about how TikTok in the US behaves very differently, TikTok in China. That in China it's much more closely regulated. So its content in terms of like how much children are able to be influenced by the dance videos and everything else is considerably circumscribed. So I think that again, that should be another reason to spark a debate about, that whether is that a personal responsibility, is a platform responsibility, or is this something that the state can ensure that how much of these platforms, especially for people of a younger age, that what kind of content is served to them.
Yeah, you bring in a kind of potential topic there of looking at varieties of kind of digital capitalism across different countries, and sort of the ways in which the kind of political ideologies and politics of different countries shape the way that these things are regulated. And then also paying attention to what Nanjala said about the kind of global hierarchies, the degree to which the ability to control and regulate these things is not shared equally among different countries. Okay, I just want to bring in Amil, and then one person in the audience has asked if everybody could share, the panelists could share some social media links where they can follow them going forward. So I might ask you all to talk about your Twitter handles at the end, just to give people an idea of where they can follow your work. But Amil.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Laura. So I would say I've just thought to zoom out and think about all the questions and the responses that we discussed on the panel, and to encapsulate, I think, the one issue that kept coming up that we haven't so far addressed at the moment. The issue was around, I think, how social media companies could be differently owned. So sort of we touched on it in different ways. So is the private model part of the problem that it is, and I mentioned that it's there to create profit. So then that, of course, brings in the issue of whether or not public ownership is a better solution. And potentially you can see the logic in there. I would say from experience of dealing with social media companies and government, and seeing government try and deal with social media, that in general, I would say, at least the governments that I've dealt with in the past, they are basically way too slow to deal with. Social media moves so fast, technology moves so fast, the way the dynamics move. And unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, Mark Zuckerberg saying, break things and think about it later, it has become encapsulated in the sort of mentality of the social media platforms, the companies, and the social media tech world. And government doesn't work like that at all, especially governments with parliaments and regulations or whatever. So in principle, I would like to see, I'd love to see a publicly owned. So I know the BBC has sort of thought about these kind of things. In practice, I think it's not really likely to happen. So I would say, if I was being asked, to advise or something, a political actor, I would say let's think about broad but targeted legislation that deals with the infrastructure and deals with the critical principles. So like a principle being that social media platforms aren't responsible legally for the platform because they're not really the publishers. They're just, a board that, other people put their views on, and therefore those other people should be held responsible, not them. So do we want to let them get away with that? That's a critical issue. Like if the EU or the US or somebody says, no, actually, Facebook, you are legally responsible, that's going to have a massive impact. So I think legislation that carefully deliberates on these issues, gets to the point, issues lots and lots of, white papers along the way and thinks about it, and then comes out with a ruling that makes sense. It would take time, but it would be worth it, and that ruling would probably be able to stand for a while and not have to constantly change. So I would say yes, I think we're stuck with the private sector ownership model. I've seen other models come and go and not really gain traction, but I would like to see legislation really deal with the core issues, and I think it can do that.
Okay, thank you all very, very, very much. We really appreciate you coming and talking to us. And I think it's been a really interesting conversation, and hopefully it's got people thinking about these issues in a more critical way and a more kind of nuanced way across contexts. Just want to close by asking you if you could all briefly say, where can people follow you? So Amil, where can people follow you?
So I'm just typing it in now. My own Twitter handle is @LondonStani, and our work on where we post quite a bit of research and and stuff that we're interested in is valent_projects.
Okay, and Kache?
I have already inputted in the chat box my Twitter.
So it's Fang GKC.
KC. Yeah.
Okay, and Nanjala. They
I'm
can
on the
read your
internet.
books, but
Yeah. I'm the books. They're in the bookstores. I can't remember how to type out the Mastodon. It's a little bit of a, but I will figure it out and I'll put it in the chat. I'm one of the pivoters.
Okay, I'm too lazy currently to transition.
Well, we can talk about it later, but I think people should really be very conscious of the fact that things are changing.
And Idris is at IM_pulse and put it in the chat. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming, and thank you to all of our panelists. We're very happy that you came and talked to us, and hopefully next year we might be able to welcome you guys in person to LSE as well. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Bye.